Good evening. Our study of diaspora tales brings us today to a book that I suspect most people are not familiar with, even though the book itself contains predicaments and situations that many people living in a diasporic context will recognize and will consider to be actual and familiar to their very lives. The name of the book, Three Maccabees, is something of a misnomer. It has nothing to do with the Maccabean era, or rather with the Maccabean uprising. And apparently the book itself was probably copied in manuscripts together with the first two books of Maccabees and simply attained the title Three Maccabees, even though the event that begins Three Maccabees actually took place some 50 years or so before the Maccabean uprising. So it has nothing to do with the Maccabees at all. The book itself is interesting. It takes place in two stages. The story opens in the land of Israel, very briefly, for just about a chapter or so, and then takes us to the major thrust of the book, to the life of the Jews in Hellenistic Egypt, particularly in Alexandria, but not only Alexandria. The story actually begins in the year 217. And the background is one of the greatest battles in the classical world, the Battle of Rafah, or Rafiach, which takes place in June of 217 BCE. But even before we get to that battle, the book itself begins with an event, a very particular, specific story, that one of the generals in the army that is going to take part in this war. Maybe I should have actually begun by stressing that the war that opens the book of Three Maccabees is another of the major military confrontations between the two powerful Hellenistic empires of the Middle East, the Seleucid Empire based in Syria and the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt, in Hellenistic Egypt. And these two empires had been battling now for control, among other things, of the land of Israel for the past 100 years almost. The Ptolemies had ruled Judea beginning around the year 300, and they will ultimately rule the land for about 100 years, until the year 200 BCE. But in the year 217, actually the invasion began a bit earlier, the Syrian Empire, the Syrian Seleucid Empire, invades Ptolemaic territory and captures just about all of the land of Israel and makes it to southern Israel, to the Gaza Strip, and to the city of Rafah, or Rafiach. And it is there that the two armies clash. But before we read about that clash, an interesting event takes place. One of the generals in the Syrian, or one of the commanders at least, in the Syrian army, a fellow by the name of Theodotus, took some of Ptolemy's best soldiers, right? These, in other words, are renegade soldiers, and they went to Ptolemy. The king is Ptolemy IV, Philopator. They went to Ptolemy's tent, intending to kill him. However, Dositeus, son of Drimilos, who was a Jew by birth but later renounced the law and abandoned his ancestral beliefs, removed Ptolemy. In other words, the king was removed from that tent and placed instead a poor unknown fellow in his place. And he, that unknown fellow, suffered the fate intended for Ptolemy. Now, this is an interesting introduction to this book. First of all, I suspect that some of you recognize and identify this story with the beginning, or not quite the beginning, but towards the beginning of the book of Esther that we just read a few days ago. There, too, there was a plot against the king, and in that case, in Esther, the hero of the story, Mordecai, discovers the plot and saves the king's life. Here, this is a Jew, but one who renounced the law. In other words, he's something of a renegade Jew of sorts, and it's not quite clear what the author wanted to achieve by stressing this. You'll notice my journalistic heading here. Jew foils plot against King Ptolemy. So on the one hand, there's a positive sense in that Jews, or at least this particular Jew, was loyal to the king, and that issue is going to repeat itself time and again in this book. And I would almost say a crucial component of the propaganda element of the third book of Maccabees. We'll see that in a few minutes. By the way, Daziteus, son of Drimilus, was a real person. He's actually mentioned in a number of papyri that were discovered in Egypt. And so, whereas the book itself is probably mostly legend, but there are certain characters, such as the king himself, Ptolemy IV, whom we can place in a historical slot. The war, as I said, is about to take place. Here we are with the numbers on June 22nd, 217. The two armies are opposite each other, and this ultimate clash. Now, if you look at the numbers here, right? The numbers, by the way, were reported by the well-known Greek historian Polybius. Ptolemy, the Egyptian king, deploys 70,000 infantry, another 5,000 cavalry, and 73 elephants. And his opponent, Antiochus III the Great, this is Antiochus, the father of Antiochus Epiphanes, whom we all remember from the Maccabean uprising. His father, the Great, however, was in fact a great conqueror, and he deploys 62,000 infantrymen, another 6,000 cavalry. So we have about 140,000 soldiers going into battle here. As I said, one of the great battles of antiquity. And the winner was Ptolemy IV Philopator. The Ptolemaic army, in a last gasp, manages to push back the Syrians all the way back to the Syrian land itself, and the land of Judea remained in Ptolemaic hands for another, at least until the year 200 BCE. But then something interesting happens. Ptolemy is enamored with this land that he has recaptured, or captured as it were, and he visits a number of cities in the land of Israel, one of them, of course, being Jerusalem. He arrives in Jerusalem, and actually, at first, evinces a very positive attitude towards the Jews and towards the city of Jerusalem and the temple of Jerusalem, and he'd like to visit the temple, and he'd like to enter the sanctuary. And so Ptolemy came to Jerusalem. He sacrificed to God. In other words, he offered up a sacrifice in the temple, and then asked whether he could enter the sanctuary. And they, the Jews of Jerusalem, told him this was improper. However, he was not convinced, and he is going to attempt to enter the city, or rather the sanctuary of the Temple of Jerusalem, only to be rebuffed by all sorts of miraculous interventions, together with the Jews of Jerusalem, who very simply were not about to let the king enter the sanctuary, an area that was forbidden entry except to the high priest now on the Day of Atonement. It's very interesting. A very, very similar story appears in the second book of Maccabees, where the Syrian king sends a governor, or a messenger, as it were, to Jerusalem also to sack the temple in Jerusalem. There again, the Jews try to prevent his entry into the temple, and miraculously he is smitten, this messenger sent by the Syrians, and is forced to return to Syria. So it could very well be that the author of 3 Maccabees already had access to 2 Maccabees. We don't know when the book itself was written, 3 Maccabees, and there are all sorts of opinions. I would guess somewhere towards the end of the 1st century BCE, maybe the very beginning of the rule of Augustus, or the years of the rule of Augustus. In other words, the turn from the Hellenistic rule of the East to Roman rule. Nevertheless, Ptolemy wants to enter the temple. He's rebuffed, but he spiritedly ignored everything and attempted to enter. Then God, who watches over everything and is holy among the holies before all, heard the prayer of the high priest. This is the first of 2 major prayers that appear in the 3rd book of Maccabees. And this is an important component of this book. We think that the author of 3 Maccabees probably read Hellenistic literature, Hellenistic historiography, The prayers in his book take the place of speeches in Hellenistic historiography. That's where the speaker can really reflect, can really express his beliefs, his feelings, his anguish, right? And that's what the high priest Simon does here. He prays to prevent this entry by the king into the Holy of Holies. And God flogs the king, and it's hard to figure out who exactly was behind this flogging. Sometime, in other words, it was a miraculous intervention. Sometime later he recovered, not having developed any regrets at all. And he, the king, departed with bitter threats. And the bitter threats are very interesting. He wants to punish Jews. But he's going to return to Egypt and to Alexandria and seek to punish the Jews of Egypt for what their brethren in Jerusalem did by not permitting him to enter the temple. This is an interesting point. The author of 3 Maccabees identifies the Jews of Jerusalem with the Jews of Egypt, even though they live in another, as it were, in another empire. But in antiquity, that identification constantly repeats itself. When the Romans ultimately capture the city of Jerusalem, destroy the temple in the year 70 CE, and destroy the city of Jerusalem, they impose a tax not only on the Jews of Israel, but on the Jews throughout the Roman Empire. In other words, again, that same idea that Jews living everywhere bear the guilt for what their brothers in Jerusalem might have done, or may have at least attempted to do. And so he goes back to Egypt. Here, by the way, we have a picture of the Jews on the Temple Mount, and you can see on the lower right where you can almost make out the king's crown, but he is prevented by the priests and by the Jews from entering the temple. Just a sidelight, 3 Maccabees never received the canonization of the other books of Maccabees, 1 and 2, that were an integral part of the Septuagint, of the Greek translation of the Bible. 3 Maccabees does not appear in some of the major manuscripts of the Septuagint. It was attached in some manuscripts to the Greek Bible, but it was never really canonized by the Catholic Church, as were the other books of the Septuagint, and certainly the Vulgate, the Vulgata of Jerome, which became the standard text ultimately for the Catholic Church as well. And so the book was never canonized, as we saw, at least by part of the church. We saw that with the book of Tobit. So Tobit enjoyed a lot of art because the book itself was read at least by major segments of Christendom. This was not the case with 3 Maccabees, but every now and then we find a Dutch artist, in this case a fellow by Jan Luyken, a very strange fellow, by the way. He begins as an erotic poet and then suddenly becomes an ascetic, and then becomes, he's a great believer in Christian martyrdom of sorts and other types of pietistic behavior. And he drew a number of pictures based on 3 Maccabees, and here is one of the pictures. But the Jew returns to Egypt and issues a decree against the Jews of that land. When he had returned to Egypt and his evil impulse had increased, he tasked the public with passing a censure against the race of the Jews. And then he set up a stele, chiseling an inscription, saying that no one who was not sacrificing, and we'll see that sacrificing here means sacrificing to Dionysus and various other pagan deities, but Dionysus is the central figure for pagan sacrifice that is to be imposed, or at least the king will try to impose it on the Jews of Egypt. But those who would not sacrifice could not go into their own temples, meaning, well, synagogues or what have you. And all Jews were to be enrolled in a poll tax. We're not sure what this poll tax is. Was it a uniquely Egyptian poll tax? Some people claim that this is actually a poll tax that appears in the early Roman period of control of the Near East under Augustus. But clearly it is a lowering of their civil status. And they were to be given servile status. And that, meaning the Jews would be now lowered to a servile status. And that those who resisted with force were to be removed from life. In other words, if you resist sacrificing to some pagan deities, you would sacrifice your life. And those who were enrolled, meaning who became part of the cult of Dionysus, were to be marked with fire on their bodies with the symbol of Dionysus, an ivy leaf. And this is interesting because we know that this branding or tattooing, as it were, of symbols of the cult of Dionysus was in fact quite common. In fact, the king himself might have had a brand or a tattoo like this. And the idea was to create a uniform acceptance of this cult. So it's not so much a religious issue, but it's also a political issue, creating this uniformity. And they were also, the Jews were also assigned to their earlier humbled status. We have a tradition in the letter of Aristeas, another Jewish work coming from Hellenistic Egypt, that tells us that it was Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who actually freed Jews who had become slaves at some stage at the very beginning of the Hellenistic period and now were freed. Now, Ptolemy IV is going to restore their humbled status to, we don't know if it's slavery or at least some lower civil status. But now comes an interesting addition. But so that he would not appear detestable to everyone, he added that if anyone preferred to be converted into one of those who had been initiated into the mystic rites, in other words, if there will be Jews who do go along with conversion to pagan rites, they would be equal to Alexandrian citizens. And this, of course, is a tremendous prize, we would imagine, in the eyes of the Greek king. In other words, you can assume Alexandrian citizenship, to which were attached all sorts of rights and privileges. Your children can go to the gymnasium. It would probably advance your own, maybe your own employment. Certainly, all sorts of income would derive from Alexandrian citizenship. It was really a feather in your cap. Obviously, you were raised to a higher civil status. And the big question is, how many Jews will go along with this offer? And we are told by the author of 3 Maccabees, that's some in the city, showing their hatred for the means of maintaining the piety of the city. In other words, some Jews who had no use for their piety unscrupulously surrendered themselves, as if they were gaining a share of something great, glory from their future interaction with the king. In other words, we are told, and this is something we didn't really experience when we read the book of Tobit. Yes, we were told at the very beginning that there were some people that weren't particular about eating proper food. But here we're told about a segment of the Jewish community that goes along with this offer of citizenship. And they considered themselves deriving glory from their future interaction with the king. But the majority were empowered with a noble spirit, meaning a majority of Jews had a noble spirit and did not abandon their piety and exchanged their money for their lives. In other words, they were willing to forego their, not only their wealth, but their proposed wealth and money. If they assume citizenship, they were willing to exchange that for their very lives. They fearlessly attempted to protect themselves from the registration. They remained hopeful that they would receive assistance, and doesn't say from whom yet, and they detested those who abandoned them. Now, this is interesting. Here we encounter a split within the community. Those loyal to their Jewish beliefs detest those who abandon them. And we'll see the ramifications a bit further on in the book. And they considered them enemies of the nation, meaning the nation of Jewry, and refused to live alongside them or give them assistance. So here we didn't encounter this civic or civil or city split of the Jewish community between those loyal to their Judaism and those who are willing to abandon their Judaism for a promise of citizenship. Here we encounter a split community, and the question is, how will this community now continue to behave together with each other and vis-a-vis the outsiders, meaning the Greeks or the indigenous Egyptian population. The king issues a decree that relates not just to the Jews of Alexandria, but to all the Jews of Egypt. When the ungodly man, that is Ptolemy IV, learned that these things, that there were Jews who refused to go along with his plan, he was so angry that not only did he rage at those in Alexandria, meaning those Jews in Alexandria, but he even opposed those deep in the countryside. In other words, this spread throughout the land of Egypt. And he ordered that all those who were zealous, meaning Jewish zealotry, should be gathered together in the same place. And ultimately, this will be a hippodrome and be executed in the worst way possible. In other words, we encounter here a decree against all of Jewry, or at least all of those Jews loyal to their religious beliefs, right? They are about to be executed in the most cruel manner possible. And so this is the great drama as we reach the third paragraph, this third chapter of 3 Maccabees. What is going to happen? But the Jews remain loyal, and now the book of 3 Maccabees really exposes, I would say, his propagandist intentions in writing this book. The Jews nevertheless preserved their unchangeable goodwill and faith towards the kings. In other words, this did not render Jews disloyal to the land, to the country, to the government. They are still faithful to the kings, but they worshipped God, meaning the Jewish God, and conducted their affairs according to his laws, maintaining a distinction in accordance with the law about foods, for which reason they seemed hateful to some people. This, of course, alludes to the Hellenistic understanding that uniformity and unity is a major principle in the Hellenistic world. Assimilation is a positive manifestation. You belong to a great culture and to a great civilization. If you do not eat with us and do not marry with us and join us in some sort of religious activity, you're a danger. You might be disloyal. Your loyalty is elsewhere. Hence, you might be considered hateful to some people. And so now we hear for the first time that the separateness of the Jews raises a problem. Can you remain loyal? And this is really the question of 3 Maccabees. Can you remain loyal to the kingdom and still remain loyal to your Judaism and to your Jewish principles? Or is there a clash by definition? The Jews will be accused of disloyalty. But since they conducted their interactions with all people with the good conduct of the just, they had achieved good repute. In other words, as we will see in a minute, they will be accused of disloyalty, but they themselves continue to maintain a proper, I would say, stature and a proper behavior. The good conduct is recognized, hence they have good repute. But some of the foreigners, and foreigners here does not necessarily mean Greeks of Alexandria. It could mean some of the, again, indigenous population of Egypt and maybe of Alexandria. Some of the foreigners took no account of the good conduct of the Jewish race, which was commonly spoken about by everyone, meaning by everyone else. Instead, they spoke about the separation of their worship and their food. This issue, separation, is a constant factor in the Hellenistic and even later on in the Roman period. If you read Tacitus on the Jews, he too stresses that they are separate, they don't marry with us, they don't interact with us, and so on. And so these people who take an anti-Jewish position stress the separation of their worship, saying that they were not people who made the same sacrifices to the king and the armed forces. In other words, this is not just disloyalty in a general sense because of religious values. This is disloyalty to the king, to the armed forces, meaning to the nation, to the Hellenistic Empire or Ptolemaic Empire, and that they were hostile to them and deeply opposed to their affairs. In other words, you can't trust Jews. and they attacked them, meaning the foreigners attacked the Jews with extraordinary criticism. And now comes what I consider to be one of the most fascinating elements within this book of 3 Maccabees. Not all the Greeks went along with this anti-Jewish attitude and ultimate wish for persecution. There are other Greeks, and when you read about them, you can't help but conjure up a similar situation that Jews encountered in the past century. Since the Greeks in the city had not been wronged at all. In other words, there were Greeks who saw no reason to persecute Jews. When they saw the unexpected fuss about the Jewish people and unexpected riots taking place, they were not able to help because of the tyrannical government. They were afraid of what the king might do. But they consoled them, meaning the Jews, felt terrible, and assumed that these orders, meaning the orders laid down by the king and his henchmen, would be changed. For such a great community, the Jewish community, which had done no wrong, would not be overlooked in this way. But now comes a striking line. But now some neighbors of Jews, friends and co-workers, drew some of them in secretly. They hid the Jews, giving promises that they would vouch for them and would contribute everything eagerly in support. And this phenomena is striking, that there are, quote, what I put in parentheses, good Greeks who take Jews into their houses, hide them, and are threatened by the government for doing this. Look at the decree that Ptolemy issues against this. King Ptolemy, Philopator, to the generals and soldiers in Egypt and every other place, greetings and good health. I added here an explanation. Ptolemy proceeds here to describe the events in Jerusalem. In other words, what happened to him in Jerusalem and the terrible behavior of the Jews there who wouldn't let him enter the temple. And then later in Egypt, leading to the decrees against the Jews. He continues, that is the king, we went so far as to change their state completely, meaning their status, deciding to reward them with citizenship of Alexandria and to make them participants in all our holy things. But they reacted in the opposite manner and thrust away this beautiful thing in favor of their innate evil behavior, continually turning to badness. Not only did they reject the priceless citizenship, but they even despised, out loud and silently, the few among them. Again, the king alludes to this internal dissension within the Jewish community, and so they despised those among them who behaved properly towards us. And now, the roundup of the Jews. Again, so familiar to Jews living in other diasporas in other centuries. For once, the king promises, once they have all been punished, we will have finally managed to bring our affairs into stability. Whoever hides one of the Jews, whether old, young, or infants, will be annihilated with the most shameful torture along with their whole family. In other words, now you have a decree not only against Jews, but against those Greeks who are hiding Jews, and if they are discovered, they too will suffer. Anyone, and on the other hand, anyone who is willing to inform on them will receive in exchange the property of the person who comes under judgment, meaning that Jew, and 2,000 drachmas of royal silver, will also get their freedom, should they not be fully freed if they're slaves, and will be crowned. Any place whatsoever in which a Jew is found to be hiding shall be made desolate and burnt up, and shall be rendered useless in every way to all mortal beings for all time. Again, one can't help but draw comparisons to the events that we all recognize that took place just a few generations ago. And here we encounter now for the first time a diasporic tale of a Jewish community that's trying to work out a solution where it can remain a loyal citizen and at the same time a loyal Jew. But now we reach an ultimate stage in the book of 3 Maccabees. Here we read how the plot to exterminate the Jews was to be carried out. the king summons one of his henchmen, a fellow by the name of Haman. Now, I know you're going to say sounds like Haman, and there are some similarities between this book and the book of Esther, no doubt, but there are the major differences as well. One of the major differences is the book of 3 Maccabees has no hero, has no outstanding Jewish hero. There are a couple of priests that pray, but there's no Esther here, there's no Mordechai here. It's the Jewish community en masse that takes a stand against these decrees. But the Egyptians are about, at least Haman, the advisor, right, to the king, is summoned, and the king, ordered him to gather elements, 500 elements, and to give these elements bountiful handfuls of frankincense and lots of undiluted wine to drink, in other words, to render them drunk. Once they had become wild from the plentiful supply of drink, Haman, was to lead them in so that the Jews would meet their doom. They would be trampled. And here follows the Jews praying for reversal of the decree. Again, prayer is a major issue. I can already begin by stressing this. For the third book of Maccabees, prayer is, in a sense, even more potent than sacrificial worship in Jerusalem. And if prayer is so potent, that means that Jews ultimately can survive wherever they may live. And so one has to wonder if there's not a subtext here in this book that not only describes the loyalty of Jews to their religious beliefs, right, but maybe suggests a certain legitimacy to life abroad because Jewish prayers, even in the diaspora, are heard by God. In any case, what happened? The elephants are about to be led in to trample the Jews, but then God intervenes. There is a beautiful creation for all time, which is granted night and day by gracious God to everyone he wishes. What is this innovation? A bit of sleep. And he sent some to the king. In other words, God renders the king, Ptolemy, he forces him to fall asleep. So he fell into a deep, sweet sleep by the power of the Lord. His unlawful plan was entirely thwarted. He's asleep. That's it. Nothing else happens. He was entirely cheated of his unalterable calculation. In other words, God, as you'll see in a minute, intervenes a number of times. The first time by rendering the king simply unconscious, and as a result, the decree simply fades away. But that's not the end of the story. Another attempt and another failure. Haman again gathers the elephants, and he explains the beasts and the forces are ready, king, in accordance with your strict command. But the king is already fickle here, and he can't make up his mind. At these words, the king, was filled with deep wrath. He was angry with this Haman. Why? Because God's will in this matter was scattering all his thinking. He suddenly got mixed up because God was somehow causing him to have second thoughts. And he said obstinately and threateningly to his Egyptian advisor Haman, if your parents were here, or the children of your children, I would cast them to wild beasts as a rich meal, rather than blameless people who accepted my ancestors and always remained solidly faithful like the Jews. Wow. Suddenly, a turn of attitude. The king suddenly realizes these Jews and their forefathers were basically always faithful and always loyal to the kingdom and to my ancestors. How can we suddenly execute them? And this is so typical. This king changes his mind. So you can say, if you wish, again, reminiscent of Achashverosh, who can easily be swayed one way or another. And the king here suddenly realizes these Jews may not be as threatening as I had thought originally. And here, one of the elders of the Jewish community, Elazar, a priest, prays, and we encounter possibly the only real miracle, or at least the second major miracle of the third book of Maccabees. Elazar was a distinguished man, one of the priests. He calmed the old men around him. Remember, the Jews still think they are about to be trampled and executed. He calmed the old men around him to invoke the holy God and prayed like this: O King, great-powered, highest, all-powerful God, who guides the whole of creation with pity, look down on the seed of Abraham, on the children of sanctified Jacob, the people of your sanctified inheritance, who are perishing unjustly. And now comes an interesting line: as strangers in a strange land. And so much has been written about this clause. What is the author trying to suggest? What is Elazar suggesting by saying we are strangers in a strange land? Is he suggesting that we all ought to get up, pack up, and move to Israel? Some scholars have suggested that's exactly the point of this clause here. We are strangers in a strange land. We don't belong here. We are outsiders, and we should go home. Other scholars have claimed just the opposite. We're strangers, and that has to be rectified. We're in a strange land, but slowly the king and his supporters will realize that we are loyal. We are no longer strangers in a strange land. We are loyal citizens. Yes, we are Jews, but they can accept that, the local government, as long as we are loyal to the country itself. So we can read the prayer in a number of ways, and you might think that I'm stretching this, but in the end, that's how the book ends. The Jews, in fact, remain in Egypt, and they go home to their homes in Egypt. So maybe they do want to restructure their status to no longer remain strangers in a strange land. When Elazar stopped speaking, the king came into the hippodrome with the beasts and all the grunting of his forces. Now remember, the king changed his mind again, and now he's again about to have the Jews executed. When the Jews saw this, they shouted to the sky. Then the super glorious, all-powerful, and true God showed his holy face, opening the heavenly gates, from which two glorious and fearsome angels descended, visible to everyone except the Jews. This is interesting. In other words, God's interference through angels was seen by others because the message is for others. The message is not for the Jews themselves, apparently. Otherwise, this clause is a very difficult clause, and we're not quite sure how to explain it. In any case, these two angels stood in the way, filled the opponent's forces with disorder, meaning the Greeks or soldiers of Ptolemy were now in a state of disorder and terror, and bound them with unmoving shackles. Even the body of the king shuddered a bit, and forgetfulness took his deep-spirited boldness. Again, he forgets. And then comes the ultimate element of the miracle. Then the beasts, meaning the elephants, turned upon the armed forces following them, trampled them down, and destroyed them. In other words, the elephants turn around and trample. Here you see, if you look at the top of the picture, you can see the wings of the two angels, right, coming down. You can see the elephants on the left, in the middle of the picture on the left. Again, another depiction by Jan Luyken, again, one of the few Dutch artists who painted scenes from 3 Maccabees. And here you see the miraculous intervention of God from the heavens through these two angels. There's another picture here of elephants, but it's from another war, and so we'll skip over it. Then the king's anger was transformed into pity and tears at the things he had previously plotted. This was enough. This supernatural intervention finally changes the attitude of the king. His anger was transformed into pity and tears at the things he had previously plotted. Weeping with anger, he threatened his friends, saying, "Who is it who has removed the men who hold the strongholds of the land in faith for us from their homes?" In other words, it almost sounds like Esther, Mihu ze ve'ezehu, right? Who is this person who has done the following? And so here again the king suggests, who are those people? It's very interesting. The book slowly depicts the king as not being all that responsible. It was his advisors that convinced him to take these steps against the Jews, which of course is a classic attempt at correcting evil behavior of the monarch by saying it wasn't his fault, it was the people who surrounded him. So the king now declares, who are these people who had these Jews removed? Jews who hold the strongholds of the land for us. They support us. They protect us. And they were removed from their homes, irrationally gathered them here. Who is it who has inflicted such wrongful suffering on people from our realm? And I had to underline this. Who have been distinguished from all people from the beginning by their good will for us in all things. It's funny, he didn't know about this a couple of pages ago, right, in the third book of Maccabees. But suddenly the king speaks with a totally different tone, right? They were always distinguished as having goodwill towards us in all things, having often shown themselves to be the best of men in dangerous circumstances. They were even willing to undergo all sorts of dangerous situations on our behalf. In other words, this is a tremendous turnaround, where the Jews now can be loyal Jews and yet be deemed to be loyal citizens at the same time. What else could a diaspora community ask for, right? They're embraced by the local non-Jewish population, and yet they are loyal to their Jewish beliefs. And so the king decrees, release them, remove these unjust change, send them out to their own places, meaning where they live in peace, after apologizing for what has been done. You destroyed the sons of the all-powerful living God who is in heaven. In other words, he's now arguing against his advisors. You are responsible for destroying these Jews who are, as it were, sons of the all-powerful God. Now, this is an interesting point. There is no attempt in the third book of Maccabees to convert Gentiles to Jews. If you remember, the book of Esther says, the population of the land became Judaized, right? They converted. That does not happen in three Maccabees. I would go a step further. 3 Maccabees does not attempt to cause, as it were, tension between Jews and non-Jews. There's nothing anti-Greek here. The author recognizes why some Greeks do not favor Jews, because they are different, because they are separate, because they won't go along with the rest of the Greek population. But there's no real sense of animosity towards the Greek population per se, even though you could say that animosity was aroused by some of the attempts. But quite frankly, the book seems to be written by somebody who is at home in a Hellenistic, in this case, Ptolemaic empire. He realizes that there are all sorts of vicissitudes in the nature of the relations between Jews and non-Jews, but that basically we can be loyal citizens of the land. And not only that, these Jews who had provided uninterrupted tranquility with glory to our affairs from the time of our ancestors up till now. Again, this idea that Jews were always loyal. So he said these things. The Jews were released right away and praised their holy God, their Savior, since they had escaped death. The king then writes a letter on behalf of the Jews. Let's read part of the letter. King Ptolemy, Philopator, to the generals in Egypt and all those in charge of affairs, greetings and well wishes. Some of our friends, pushing us too bitterly into a bad disposition, persuaded us to gather up all the Jews in the kingdom to punish them with the outlandish punishments of rebels. Again, he moves all of the blame to his advisors. My friends told me to do this against my better sense, right? And finally, I saw the light and now I've rescinded these decrees against the Jews. So the king now comes out as being a positive friend and supporter of the Jewish community and against those wicked advisors of his. We chastise the friends responsible for this very harshly for these things, since we knew that heavenly God watches over the Jews attentively. Now, I stress again, nowhere in this book is there an attempt to convert the king, to convert the local Greek population or the indigenous Egyptian population. And nevertheless, the king recognizes that there is a heavenly God that watches over them, fighting for them through everything like a father for his sons. We reckoned up the firm goodwill of a friend which they have for us and our ancestors. They are friends of us and our ancestors. So we have justly released them from any kind of blame whatsoever. And we have instructed everyone to return all of them to their homes, with no one hurting them at all anywhere. It's interesting, by the way, one of the things, of course, that the king could not ignore is the miracle of the elephants who turned around and trampled his own soldiers. Now, apparently, there was a holiday in Jewish Hellenistic Egypt known as the holiday of elephants. And there was another story, and Josephus actually reports this story in one of his books, that describes a very similar event where Jews were about to be trampled by elephants, but ultimately were saved and the elephants went off in a different direction. So it could be that what we have here in the book, among other things, is an etiological explanation of how the Feast of the Elephants came about, and someone composed this story. But it's only a particular chapter within the book. The book deals with a far greater issue. And that issue, of course, is, as I've said, how the Jews reconcile themselves to a life in a foreign country, in a foreign city, in a city that, and I would say among a population that may look askance at those people who are separate, who are different, who don't marry with us, who don't eat with us, who don't live as one with us, don't participate in the cult of Dionysus, for instance. In other words, this was the major challenge that Jews had to confront. And the book of 3 Maccabees seems to be saying there is a solution, and we can have our cake and eat it too. In other words, we can be loyal citizens to the Ptolemaic Empire and loyal Jews to our religious beliefs. And he says, we chastise our friends since we knew that Heavenly God watches over them, and they now will return to their homes. And so the Jews took this letter and were not eager to be quick about their departure. And now, sort of an epilogue, one that you may remember from the book of Esther, but a totally different one. They asked the king also that those people from the race of the Jews who had voluntarily transgressed against the holy God and God's law for their own benefit receive punishment. In other words, if you remember at the end of Esther, the Jews of Shushan asked for an extra day to take out to punish, as it were, those local residents who were about to kill them. And they asked for another day of punishment and actually of execution of those people. And so many hundred people were added to those killed in the previous day. Here the Jews asked to take out, as it were, the disloyal Jews who were voluntarily transgressed God's law for their own benefit. In other words, this dissension within the Jewish community still exists. And there's a split. And they want to take out now, they want to punish those Jews who transgressed. And they do this, claiming that since they had transgressed the divine commands, they would never be well disposed towards the affairs of the king. This is interesting. If you're not a good Jew, you can't be a good Egyptian as well, right? And the king thought that they spoke the truth, and agreed to give them complete license to utterly destroy those who had transgressed against the law of God, meaning Jews, in every place subject to his kingship. So that on that day they killed over 300 men. In other words, in addition to, or not in addition, but whereas the mass of Jews were not killed, those 300 Jews who were, as it were, renegades to their religion, they were killed by their brethren for their willingness to abandon Judaism. So on that day, they killed over 300 men, and they were happy with joy because they had subdued the unhallowed people. And then the Jews returned home. They then returned home peacefully, making appropriate thanksgiving as they had decided to treat these days as festive. They consecrated them with an inscription on a pillar. And in fact, they decreed that there would be a holiday to be celebrated. So again, it reminds us, among other things, of the book of Esther, although you could say also that there's a holiday in 2 Maccabees, Hanukkah also. But they consecrated them with an inscription on a pillar and went away secure, free, rejoicing, returning safely by land, sea, and river, thanks to the command of the king, each to their own home. So they're returning home, not to Jerusalem. They're returning home to the countryside of Egypt, with more power over the enemies than before. That kind of reminds us again of maybe of Mordechai, who now is even more powerful than he was at the beginning. Bottom line to this story, it gives us, I think, tremendous insight into the dilemma that the Jews faced as foreigners in a foreign land. What do we do? Do we get up and leave? Or do we try to change the reality here? And at least 3 Maccabees suggests you can, through what I would have to call propaganda. This work is legendary, and yet in many ways it's propaganda literature, right? It's apologetical literature. It wishes to portray to Greek readers, the book was written in Greek, to Greek readers, the loyalty of Jews. Now, it could also have been written for Jews to read, right? To enhance their sense of belonging, as it were, in Hellenistic Egypt. But this is so different from the book of Tobit that didn't encounter these problems, or at least doesn't tell us anything. And you'll notice there is no reference here at the end to their ultimate wish of restoration. In other words, we saw at the end of Tobit, somebody saw fit to tell us ultimately the Jews of the sons of Israel abroad will be gathered and return to Jerusalem, etc., etc. That doesn't take place in 3 Maccabees, not because the author maybe did not believe it, but because his agenda is totally different. And so I suggest we end here, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to hear. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Gaffney. Okay, let's start with questions. I'm sorry, there's a technical issue with echo, but I'll try and be short. Lauren is asking, is there any historical evidence to any of this story?
Excellent question. And all scholars that dealt with 3 Maccabees asked that question. The vast majority will say the context is historical, meaning the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE, which opens the book of 3 Maccabees, certainly took place. And not only that, the author had access not only to Polybius, but apparently to other Greek works. So in that sense, there's something historical. Other than that, what's history here is not the event. No, there's no proof of the event of the elephants or of the persecution per se. The historical element of the book is in the atmosphere of the book, in the dilemma that Jews encountered in how to behave. And if you read carefully, when you get even to books like the works of Philo, he also asks some of these same questions, right? And he says in one of his passages, a very well-known passage, whereas Jews consider Jerusalem to be their home city or their mother city, they also consider the lands in which they reside to be their homelands because they inherited those lands from their forefathers ages ago. In other words, Philo himself really embraces a very similar type of sense of belonging, and in that sense, the book is historical. But the events per se, and the miracle of the elephants, and so on, there's probably no historical basis.
Okay, another question. When you said stronghold, is that a reference to Elephantine Island?
Except that Elephantine was much earlier. Elephantine takes us back, the area of the Aswan, where there was a Jewish colony and a military colony of sorts, but that takes us back to the Persian period, and I'm not sure that that's what the author is referring to. It could be, but it could also be, we know that in the Hellenistic period, although this is a bit early, nevertheless, the Jews set up certain areas where they resided as definite groups. Ultimately, for instance, there will be a Jewish temple. This is after the book of 3 Maccabees, not before. But there were concentrated areas of Jewish life in Egypt. It could be that they're referring to that. I don't think that so. I think the book wants to suggest these Jews militarily, because this issue appears a number of times. They've helped us in the past, right? And so I would guess that that's what 3 Maccabees is alluding to. But again, it's very hard to decipher what is historical, factual, and what is imaginary in a book like this. Yes.
Adina asked a question at the beginning of the lecture, so if it's not relevant anymore, it might be. But she asked if 3 Maccabees was written in Greek.
Three Maccabees was written in Greek, not only in Greek, it's an excellent and important question. It was written in Greek by somebody who had read Greek literature. The author knows his Greek historiography. He knows phraseology. It's not like one Maccabees that when you read two lines, you realize the original was in Hebrew and somebody translated it into Greek. This book was written in Greek by someone who knew how Greeks wrote history, how Greeks read history. And in that sense, it's quite an impressive book. It's a fairy tale in a sense, but it's a very impressive fairy tale. And again, where the true story is nevertheless embedded, right? In other words, if you do away with drunken elephants and so on, the story projects a major reality. And it was written in Greek, yes. Since it was written in Greek, our question would be, was it written for the Greeks or for the Jews? Jews read Greek, some of them, people like Philo, certainly. And this is always a debate among scholars. Who do we expect will have read this book? Would it have been Greeks or Jews? Maybe both.
Okay, we'll take one or two more questions. To what extent is Three Maccabees a precursor of the book of Esther?
There are similarities, but I wouldn't go too far because there are some major differences as well. I stressed, for instance, that there's no sense in the book of Esther of the Jews en masse being loyal. There's Mordechai who saved the king's life, and then there's Queen Esther. But you don't get a sense of citizenship, of loyal citizenry, right? Of King Ahasuerus saying that these are the most loyal citizens of my realm, etc., and we can't do these terrible things to them. It was a queen that convinced the king to change his mind, right? And to do away with Haman and ultimately his family, right? So it's not the same type of book. Yes, there are, I agree. Did the author actually have the book of Esther before him when he wrote his book? Big question. We don't know who had Esther and who didn't have Esther. I think I may have said this in an earlier talk. Esther is the one book that was not discovered at Qumran as well, among the Dead Sea sect. And you have to wonder then, why? Of all the books of the Bible, this is the one book that stands out with its absence. There are similarities. There's no doubt about it. By the way, there's similarity in a sense to another book. The book of Judith also describes a foreign general who was about to conquer portions of the land of Israel, and he is subdued by a hero, the woman, Judith, who slays him. It reminds us of Yael from the Bible. But again, these are very slight similarities. The book of Esther might be hiding in the background here, but it's not the only book hiding in the background. And as I say, the differences are nevertheless obvious. For me, the most striking difference, as I say, is there's no hero in Three Maccabees. It's the Jewish community that are the heroes, as a community and not as individuals. That's a different type of literature completely.
We're going to take a last question from Brenda. So Brenda wants to know, why do you think Esther was not found at Qumran?
That's not another lecture. That's another series of lectures, right? We don't know. Remember, it could be, we know that Esther ultimately was translated into Greek and it was rendered kosher, right? Remember, the book of Esther in its original version has no God, or there's no God mentioned there. And you have to wonder. And there's no land of Israel mentioned there. There is, Mordechai was one of those exiled from the land. But the land doesn't play a major role in the book of Esther. And God doesn't play a major role. And you have to wonder if these Qumranites, I don't know, standing at the caves near Qumran said, not in our house, right? We don't accept these books that don't recognize. I'm just guessing here. But that could be one of many solutions. That was one of the solutions that was offered at one time. In other words, the book itself was almost heretic, right? Unless when it was translated into Greek, that's when they added God and prayer and so on. There were no prayers in Esther, right? And you wonder, they fasted, and what did they do while they were fasting, right? Did they fast and pray, or did they fast and do something else? We don't know. So that it could be, but nobody really knows why Esther was singled out. It's
Great.
a later book.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Gafni. And I'm sorry if there were a few questions we didn't have time to address. Next week is our last session in the series. We hope you join us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Udi. Thank you, Kathy, who's been helping us this evening. And goodbye, everybody.